Welcome everybody to today's discussion around the role of big business in the sustainable and ethical trade conversation. I'm going to hand over to each of our speakers in turn, and they're going to spend the next 5 minutes or so just sort of outlining their thoughts and feelings on what that looks like, and then after that we'll go through some Q&A with them. So firstly, I'm going to call on Sian Conway-Wood, who is the founder of Ethical Hour. Sian, what are your thoughts on this particular question?
Thanks, Joanna. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some names that I don't know as well. So looking forward to having a vibrant discussion about this. I think it's a really timely topic. I know kind of the context for Ethical Consumer Week is around cost of living and kind of the political climate at the moment and where we're at with that. But I think kind of stepping back from those very, very immediate concerns at the moment, we're seeing big shifts in the world of sustainability and social justice and the business practices that go alongside that, and particularly from a regulation point of view. And I'm really interested in that because I kind of span both ends of the spectrum. At Ethical Hour, we're a media outlet and a membership organisation for SMEs and particularly micro businesses at the beginning of their journey. And then in my role at 181st Street, which is a communications agency, we specialise in investor relations, ESG reporting and lobbying for the good side of lobbying on environmental causes and social justice issues for charities and NGOs. So we work with very big corporates and very, very small businesses, and kind of seeing the journey of the two has been very interesting. And typically in a corporate environment, in a big business environment, for many, many years, sustainability and ethical trade has kind of sat within the marketing department and with people like me when I was in corporate of it's a nice to have, it's a PR angle, go and find some good stories of what's going on, but there's not really that kind of deep substance throughout the business to that. And that's where we've got into the world of greenwashing. And then on the flip side of that, you've got these very small businesses and these SMEs being run by people that have maybe come out of that environment or have come from a charity background and want to use the commercial angle to really drive change. And they are really, really embedding these practices in their supply chains. But obviously over the years, we've kind of started to see big business take this a lot more seriously. And now it's actually being driven by the regulators and by the finances, because investors are now using ESG to measure, so environmental, social and governance factors, to measure not just the financial performance of their investments. So they're really kind of starting to push the pressure in these areas. And then at the same time, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Advertising Standards Agency, the Competition Markets Authority, all of these big regulators are starting to clamp down and saying, if you're claiming these things, that there really has to be the substance behind it, and there really has to be embedded business practices. And I think as soon as these issues start to shift from a marketing cost center and a marketing message that's a nice to have to a risk of compliance issues, legal issues and financial issues and keeping investors happy, at that point, that's when big business really starts to take it seriously. And what I'm excited about is moving away from this us versus them on the two sides, and actually the big businesses looking to the small businesses who have already got these supply chains in place, bringing them in as part of the conversation and potentially part of the operations as well. So I think we've got a very exciting collaborative future ahead, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody thinks about this and how we can make some of that happen today.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sian. So I'm going to move next along to Andy. The same sort of thing. What are your initial sort of thoughts and feelings on this particular topic?
Yeah, hi, morning everyone. Thanks, Joanna. So it's quite an interesting angle that we come at it from, I suppose, Social Enterprise UK. So with a national body for the UK's 100,000 plus social enterprises, businesses with a social or environmental mission. And I'm part of the team, as Joanna said earlier on, that works on our corporate partnerships. And quite a while ago, we recognized that if you look at the FTSE 100 company, for example, the average FTSE 100, their annual CSR spend, I know that term's not used very often these days, but a few years ago we looked at that, it was 10 million per year, and their average annual procurement budget was £4 billion. So we quite early on realized, and Sian just mentioned supply chains just a moment ago as well, we realized that that's where we could get quite a lot of bang for our buck, really, in terms of focusing our efforts, because there are so many great B2B social enterprises out there that would love to trade more with big corporates. And so a few years ago, we launched a program called the Buy Social Corporate Challenge. We have 30 large businesses on that program now. They have spent almost over a quarter of a billion pounds actually collectively with social enterprises in the first 6 years. Now, the direction of travel, I think, is quite clear here. And if you look at these large corporations, you know, the risk decisions a few years ago, you know, I accept that a few years ago, there were probably fairly major risks about, you know, going out and bringing social enterprises into your supply chains en masse, you know, if you try to do that in big numbers. But that's certainly not the case now. There are far more social enterprises out there that are successfully trading with large companies. So the supplier pool is much stronger than it was. And let's be honest, the risks these days are the other way around. If your company is not seen to be proactively diversifying its supply chain, you've got all the reputational risks, you've got the investors, consumers, your own employees, actually, really importantly. So when I speak to a lot of our large corporations who are partnered with us, they talk about the war for talent. They realize that if they're going to be attracting and retaining the talent that they need to run their businesses, they really have to be taking this seriously. We say that if you're going to tackle ESG seriously, then supply chains is not the only place to look, but if you are looking at supply chains, you really should be. Then social enterprises is a great, you know, it's a great place to look, and we love working with these large businesses, large and medium, and all sorts of buying organisations as part of our Buy Social campaign. So yeah, I'll stop there for a moment, but yeah, I think that whole risk conversation has moved, and I think probably everyone can recognise that.
Thanks, Andy. That's great. So I'm going to move now over to Lenshina for your, again, thoughts, feelings and experiences in this area.
Hi, everyone. So, yes, as Joanna said, I'm chair of BAFTS, which is the UK Fairtrade network, and we're a network of mainly very small shops and suppliers who are working directly on Fairtrade terms with producers and artisans in the Global South. We are the UK network member of the World Fair Trade Organization, and as such we work under the 10 Principles of Fair Trade, which are all about fair trading accountability, prices, conditions, things like that. And although we are mainly small businesses, we are seeing now some of the suppliers working with big companies on the high street who are wanting to have a fair trade line within their shop. And, you know, that's great. It brings more knowledge about fair trade. It obviously brings a whole bigger volume of orders to the artisans, but it certainly isn't without its challenges. And big businesses have to actually get on board with the mindset as well that, you know, if they want to buy fair trade, then they have to understand that they're working not with big factories. You know, they might be, the people actually making the product might be working in their own home or in a small thing. And just that they need to think about the terms, the conditions and how they're working. It's not impossible, but it needs more than just buying something. It needs a mindset change. And to go back to the thing of risk, you know, there are so many consumers who are turning away from big brands. If you look at things like the Rana Plaza disaster and thousands of people dying making cheap clothes, you know, what happened in COVID where orders had been placed and garments made and then they weren't bought. You know, people, big suppliers just said, well, we're not going to buy them because we don't need them now. And companies were just left. Consumers are seeing these things and they're turning against that. That's not what they want to see. They want to see something different. So there are massive advantages to businesses to really invest in social and fair trade enterprises.
Thanks, Lenshina. That's great. Now, finally, I'm going to turn to Chris. Same question. What are your initial thoughts and feelings about the whole question of big business and working within sustainable trade?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Chris. I head up social impact at eBay in the UK. Sorry if there's a bit of background noise. I'm at an event called Purple Tuesday today, which if anyone doesn't know, definitely check it out. It's about supporting action for disabled consumers. So if I break up a little bit, it's just solely because I'm stuck in the hotel trying to keep it all a bit quiet. Anyway, so just broadly, how do we think about this as eBay? So I think just as a starting point, speaking a little bit to what Sian said, I think the general approach in the past has been, how do we engage our consumers in social impact or social action? And that starts from a starting point of what do our consumers care about right now? And that changes constantly. And so if you start with what do our consumers care about and then try and drive impact or change as the sort of, to some extent, indirect outcome of that, it's never going to work and it's never going to happen, because you're starting with what our consumers care about. How do I connect something that we do to what they care about right now? Okay, 6 months down the line, they care about something else. Let's pivot again and let's try and do something different. So you're never really sticking with the issue and the impact area that you want to focus on. And my fundamental belief is you just can't do that as a large business, and the impact that a large business can have is significant if they flip down its head and start with, what is the actual change that we want to make in the world? And that involves making some decisions and not being across every different issue. It's about saying, we feel like we have a bunch of assets within our business that can actually change something, however small, on this social or environmental issue, and starting with that. And then the end point is, how do you then connect with your stakeholders? And your consumers are one of your stakeholders. They're the ones that can drive action for you, but that has to be the end point. And in the middle of that is, how do you build the partnerships and the relationships you need to actually understand the issue properly, because you sat in your business or your big corporate or whatever these towers we're meant to sit in or whatever. You're not going to be connected enough to the issues on the ground on the issue that you want to actually drive change on. So you have to build those partnerships. So that's just generally sort of how we think about it and how I think about it from an eBay point of view. And then reflect on what we do at eBay. So we have a very big purpose of economic opportunity for all, which is incredibly ambitious. And so we really looked at, like, what does that mean for us? How do we drive proactive change on that very big purpose? And so we started to drill that down a level. And okay, it's really about economic opportunity for marginalized communities. So this focus on underserved communities as the starting point. So okay, that narrows it down a bit more. Then what's our route into that still very big goal? And I suppose we could have taken two different routes. One could be saying, well, we're going to work with one particular community. Sorry, you're going to get a tiny bit of background noise now. Hope you can hear. Or we could say we're going to work with business models that are inclusive by design, and that's where we've started from. And Joanna is repping the brand in the background from an eBay for Change point of view, so appreciate that, Joanna. And so we started a program called eBay for Change, which is all about working with social enterprises and World Fair Trade Organization businesses to help them to grow and thrive on our platform. What we have and the assets that we have, like the biggest thing that we've got is this connection to 20 million buyers, to more than 20 million buyers every month through the eBay marketplace. How do we connect those buyers to businesses that are driving impact? So we act more as the enabler. And that's what social enterprises need and want as well, is that they want to try and connect to a more mainstream audience than maybe they're able to connect to through their own marketing approach. And so I've got my 1 minute warning from Joanna, so I'll wrap up. But what that looks like is a partnership with Social Enterprise UK and the World Fair Trade Organization to bring their members onto the eBay platform, and we really provide them with three things. One is one-to-one coaching and training for 3 months to really get them to sort of navigate e-commerce, but specifically how do you optimize what you do through the eBay platform. The other is 0 fees for 12 months, and then that moves to 50% fees after that initial 12 months. So sort of de-risking coming onto eBay and supporting them to grow and embedding within the platform. And then more of a marketing and comms push from from us. So there is a hub that you can shop from right now called eBay for Change that hosts, so we work with about 250 social enterprises so far in the first 18 months. And then more of a education job from us at eBay around like, what is a social enterprise? Why is it important? Why should you care about it as a consumer? And to be blunt, I think there's a lot more we can do on the marketing and comms side. I'm sure that's my notes and finish. So that's me, Joanna. I'll pause there.
Sorry, I slightly jumped the gun then to replace the spotlight for me.
All good.
I just we agreed sort of 5 minutes for everybody, and it just felt like it was. We've got lots to cover in the next hour, and I've got 4 questions that I will go through, and I'll ask everybody from the panel in turn for their responses to these 4 questions, and then at the end of that, any questions from the people who are on the call, and then we'll wrap up. So I'm going to start off with my first question, which is, what's the biggest challenge for social and fair trade enterprises wanting to work with bigger businesses? And we'll take it in the same order that we started with. So I'm going to go to Sian first.
Oh, nice big question to kick us off, Joanna. I like it. So again, kind of thinking from both angles, really. I think at the smaller end, for these businesses that have really, really embedded these practices, they are essentially going against the grain in terms of consumer expectations. So if you look from a behavioural perspective, we are very conditioned to buy cheap, buy convenient, to not really think where things come from, or how they're made, or what we're going to do with them at the end of their life. Myriad of reasons why that is, but that's the way that we are, and that's the way that we're programmed, and trying to change behavior is a science. So to enable these small businesses to do that marketing and to do that behavior change, you just can't do it on your own. And if you think about these small businesses, they are individuals usually, or very, very small teams, and then they might grow over a few years. It's very unlikely that they have big investment, because again, the investment market up until recent years has again been focused on growth above all else and not taking these factors into account. So for the small businesses, matching up their business growth curve with their values and staying true to that social impact, that environmental impact all the way through is a really big challenge, and that has a ripple effect across the entire business. For big businesses, they have incredible infrastructure, they have big audiences, they have very strong brand recognition, they have routes into places that these small businesses might not be able to access, like space on the high street, space in supermarkets. So that partnership can really help to create that behavior change by saying, well, these big businesses that have got this social proof are now doing this, they're endorsing these businesses, they're bringing them into that system of slightly more convenient shopping, more accessible shopping, and they are creating that behavior change and making a new social norm. But we touched on it earlier, there's that risk for both sides there, you know, for a small business plugging into bigger infrastructure and a bigger brand and kind of going for growth might feel like it's a misalignment for them, and they kind of have a bit of a journey to go on there in terms of mindset as much as anything else. And they have to really do their due diligence around greenwashing and is this the right partnership, because their entire brand will not recover from a knock. Whereas some of the bigger businesses, we've seen them change their ways over time, we've seen them weather storms, we've seen them have ads pulled for greenwashing because the regulators have said no, and they can bounce back from that because they're so established. So for the small businesses, that's a really big challenge. And then for the big businesses, I think Chris was touching on it there really well, that actually they're often scared to put themselves out there and say, this is what we're doing, because if they haven't really embedded that all the way through their business, or they haven't really done that deep work to establish what do we actually stand for, rather than following the trends of what our consumers want, they can get accused of purpose washing, they can get accused of greenwashing. And we've seen that happen time and again, particularly in big moments of social awareness, so around Rana Plaza that Lenshina mentioned, Black Lives Matter, various mental health things. You know, we see brands kind of jump on these trends rather than embedding it and then not creating that consistency. So I think really the key challenge is that behavior change piece and understanding what it takes to really make that happen on both sides. And then within that, depending on their scale and where they're at on the journey, there's a myriad of challenges, but actually you can learn from each other and weather that together when you do form really successful partnerships in this space.
That's great, thanks, Sian. So if anybody has any questions throughout the course of while I'm asking my questions, feel free to leave them in the chat and we can address them at the end. So I'm going to move over now to Andy, and the same question. What's the, in your opinion, the biggest challenge for social enterprises wanting to work with big businesses?
Yeah, I'll talk about the challenges in a moment. Just to sort of talk about the advantages that social enterprises have just for a moment, which I think is quite important. So I spend a lot of time talking to, procurement people at large businesses, of course, and they do really appreciate, even if you set aside everything that's ESG, everything around sustainability, diversity, that sort of thing, they appreciate the fact that social enterprises are more innovative quite often than other businesses. They're agile, flexible businesses. We've got great examples of social enterprises from our membership that have come into very large corporations, shown how they can do the service differently from other businesses. And I think that's really, really appreciated. So we like to talk about the innovation. And our research shows that social enterprises are far more likely to have brought in a new product or service over the last 12 months than other businesses. So I think that innovation piece is really important. But to come to the challenges piece, I mean, I actually often say social enterprises, they don't really have specific challenges in terms of working with large businesses that are different from other small businesses. Most social enterprises, not all, but most of them are small businesses. So as with all small businesses, it's sometimes a capacity issue. They might not have the resources. They might not have dedicated business development teams that can really plug through on lead generation and bid writing and building networks and that sort of stuff. So it is sometimes the capacity issue. But as I said, that's with all SMEs, I would say. If you're going to push me on a specific challenge for social enterprises, I think Sian touched on the fact that we've all become accustomed to, or conditioned even to buying cheap disposable stuff, right? So if a social enterprise has set up to tackle that issue, of course you're going to be spending more. So a sort of traditional procurement person might not be taking into the full sort of like whole cost of life cycle and all of the costs of a product, and they might say, oh well, this is the cheap soap, we've always had the cheap soap in our bathrooms, we're going to stick with that instead of the social enterprise. So there is that, of course, depending on who you're working with. But the other thing I was going to mention was, the perception issue. Sometimes you'll have your corporate procurement folk who assume social enterprises don't, they're not capable, they don't quite have the professionalism or the competence of other businesses, so which is quite frustrating because our research shows that they're very often much better than other businesses. So our advice to social enterprises, and most people get this anyway, it is, first and foremost, you're a business, sell your product, service. If people later on come along and say, oh, what about this social mission and what you do with your profits, that's the cherry on top, I suppose, in terms of messaging for the corporate audience. So yeah, like other small businesses, Lenshina talked about terms and conditions, payment terms. Businesses are sometimes now saying, okay, SMEs, diverse suppliers, social enterprises, we will shorten our payment terms. That's massive. You can't have small businesses effectively subsidizing big corporations by, giving them products and services and waiting 90 days for payment, So I think slowly but surely big businesses are moving in that direction, and we're certainly pushing that message.
Excellent, thanks, Andy. So yeah, we've just mentioned Lenshina, so we'll move along to her now. So what do you see as the biggest challenge facing Fairtrade enterprises in working with bigger businesses?
Well, thank you. That was a direct link to some of what I'm going to talk about. So thank you for that. It is a mindset that's not aligned with between the two organisations, I think, can be the biggest challenge. And just again, that not understanding. So I mentioned payment terms, 90 days payment, but a fair trade enterprise will pay a large portion upfront to the people who are going to be making the product. So in that case, talking to one of our supplier members, they had a big order they were working with a large high street brand, but they were having to pay upfront in April to the artisans so that they could buy the materials and start the work and were protected. And then even with some negotiation terms, they weren't actually getting paid until November. And for a small business, that outlay is absolutely huge. You know, it's so difficult. And then again, Sian as well talked about how we're conditioned to want cheap items and sales, discounting. So high street shops, they are building in their price for heavy discounting because they will have sales very soon. Some people, even when they launch a new product line, launch it with a launch sale. So they're already discounting it before you've even started. So with that built in, then that they're pushing margins to, you know, really low because they have to build in this constant discounting. And there, you know, there's also fines for things like missing delivery targets. And Fairtrade enterprises, they are professional, but again, they're working with small producers in areas where there might be earthquakes, all sorts of reasons that might affect delivery. It's not just being lax and not wanting to get the product out, but then if you're then running the risk of fines for things going wrong, again, that can be a big problem. And it's also understanding the actual value of things. Conversations with high street brands talk about the perceived value. What would someone pay for that? And that's always driven towards getting it cheaper, not talking about how it's made, what went into making it, the supply chain of it, and why it's worth maybe a higher price. So all of those things can be, you know, a real problem, because, you know, it could end up feeling like the Fairtrade enterprise is being used just to give good stories and good publicity, but that actually it's not working as a partnership when things go wrong.
Yeah. Thanks, Lenshina. Yeah, there's obviously some really important issues that we need to be thinking about here. Chris, I'll come to you finally on that same question about the challenges facing social and fair trade enterprises when dealing with big.
Yeah, two things really. So one, which has been said a little bit already, but our experience from eBay for Change is definitely that resources is the biggest challenge, but that is, like Andy said, is widespread within small businesses. But we can see from an e-commerce perspective, you know, if you're trying to run a business, trying to deliver impact from that business as well, and then trying to become an e-commerce expert, that is a lot of stuff. And what we've seen is then social enterprises can revert to a little bit of a machine gun approach. Well, I'll put myself everywhere in the hope that it'll land somewhere, and I think that doesn't work. And I think we would all accept that wouldn't work. If you opened 5 shops and didn't support all of them, none of them would work. And so what we've seen is that, like, real focus and dedication on eBay is when it starts to produce, but also that takes time when you're competing against you know, other things on our platform. So that capacity point is a real one. And then I think from the business point of view, this sort of desperation for scale constantly within large business makes things so challenging. And I think it has to be about working. There are always going to be people within that large business that don't think that scale instantly is the right way to go, and finding those people and building the pilots together that really, like, build the connections and build the understanding are really the most positive. Because I think, exactly to Andy's point, what we see is social enterprises are really agile and are willing to try things and explore things, and that's what businesses really want. But they've also got to report up and deliver against scale constantly. And so I think that working together on the internal comms within businesses around how this works and how we build from this maybe small pilot over a period of time, when, as we all know, businesses are used to reporting every 3 months, is a really important part of that partnership, I think.
Yeah, that's great. So it seems like one of the biggest challenges, actually, looking across everything that all four of you have said, is basically about almost customer expectations or perceived customer expectations. So the bigger businesses are thinking, well, you know, our customers aren't prepared to wait for X, or aren't prepared to pay for X, or aren't prepared to put up with. And actually, maybe they are, or maybe they just need to trust their customers a bit more. So the second question, getting a little bit more positive, is who's getting it right? So which businesses are doing most in the terms of sustainable ethical trade? And what I've said to the four panelists, this could be either a corporate or it could be a small social and fair trade enterprise. So who's getting it right? John?
I'm going to break the rules a little bit, Joanna, I'm sorry, but I think there's so many people getting this right. There's so many small and big businesses doing really, really good stuff. And often they're scared to put that out there. They're scared to champion it. They're scared to talk about it. So for me, the examples of really, really good practice in this space actually come from the partnerships and the collaborations. And I think a little bit of that comes from partly the audience thing of how do we actually get this out there? How do we create behavior change? What we've talked about a lot here is that often it's our perception, like you said, of the consumer's wants and desires and behavior. And actually, it's almost that we take a safety in numbers effect of we can protect our reputations by working together, but we can also reach a wider audience and we can create that change because there's several of us involved in endorsing it. So I think examples like eBay for Change are a really strong example. Campaigns like Buy Social, organisations like BAFTS that come together and create that collaboration. I think that is a really key part of this, because actually fundamentally what we're talking about when we talk about ethical, sustainable, all of these different buzzwords and things is creating the environment that we all want to be in. You know, none of us want to go to work and come home at the end of the day having been paid not enough to live on for that day's work. And so fundamentally we can talk about different lenses on this. We can talk about the climate crisis, we can talk about mental health, all these different angles that are very, very important, but fundamentally it is creating a fairer system for everybody. And I think we can only do that when we all engage in it. So I think the best practices are actually coming out of those collaborations and that work together across the sector. And I think that's the way that we really get those that are outside the echo chamber, and there's getting less and less of them, but I think that's how we bring them in, because we say that actually we're working together, we're supportive, it's not us versus them. And I also think that's how we re-educate consumers, so we're not constantly kind of putting that first and foremost in every single conversation of, well, how do our customers behave, and let's let that dictate how we behave as businesses, because actually we've set that agenda, and through advertising and marketing and the way that we've kind of prioritized growth and things, corporations have set that agenda and now are responding to that behavior that they've created. So I think we can flip that on its head and change that, but we can only do that if we work together.
That sounds great. Yes, and I don't mind you slightly bending the rules on that, because that is a really important message. Andy, what are your thoughts on that? Who's doing it? Who's getting it right?
I'd probably get in trouble if I point out specific corporate partners of ours that are getting it right and others that are not. But so I'll talk about social enterprises maybe. I mean, we don't specifically support these businesses so much to get into the corporate supply chains that we work with, but the first names that popped into my head here actually were Fairphone and Tony's Chocolonely. I mean, these are brilliant social enterprises. They're not only producing goods that are, I mean, look at Tony's Chocolonely. Who would not grab a bar of Tony's Chocolonely? From a branding point of view? Once you've tasted it, it's great. But they're not sitting on their laurels and just trying to grow and take market share. They want to change the industries that they work in. So Fairphone, they want the rest of the smartphone industry to adopt a more modular approach, right? So that the consumer doesn't have to change phone every 2 years. You can change the battery, you can change the camera, whatever. And I think that's really, really powerful. And Tony's Shock and Lonely, they won't rest until the chocolate industry as a whole is 100% slave-free. And they've got some great collaborations, haven't they, with Ben & Jerry's and Toast Ale and all sorts of brilliant stuff going on there. So those are the first two examples that I thought of. And I'll just throw one more quick one in there. The Co-op, actually. I mean, we sometimes say, oh gosh, why are there not many social enterprises operating at scale? The Co-op is huge. We do almost all of our food shopping at the Co-op. We're lucky that we've got a great one just down the road from us. But you know, that's a really clear example where you can every day that you're food shopping just go make a difference by buying from a really good social enterprise. So yeah, just three quick examples off the top of my head there.
Yeah, that's great. And actually the Co-op is a good example in terms of it's pretty much cradle to grave, isn't it? So you can go and do your food shopping there all the time. You can get your insurance and you can get buried by them as well.
Yeah.
Literally cradle to grave.
Yes.
Lenshina, who in your opinion, who's getting it right?
Well, just to mention the Co-op, let's not forget the Fairtrade wine. Very important to any small business is being able to get good quality Fairtrade wine. I'd like to talk about the heritage sector. So museums and organisations like Guide Dogs and the National Trust. And they've started working quite closely with BAFTS members to make goods to sell in their gift shops. And they have, because they're not competing with each other, so they don't have some of the high street pressures there. You know, someone who's wants a gift from St Paul's Cathedral isn't competing with someone in a National Trust shop. So they haven't got the same, and they don't work on a discounting model. You know, they might discount their Christmas decorations afterwards, but you know, they're not constantly looking to reduce the price. And their customers are much more aligned with the message about handmade, fair trade, ethical things. You know, they will look for locally produced things in the shops, but also ethically produced fair trade items. And it can be a really great collaboration. So St Paul's Cathedral just recently launched a collection which was designed with 4 different BAFTS members. So a specific collection, and then they've got jewellery and toys all themed to this collection from different suppliers. And that's, you know, a great way of everyone working together to get really great quality products. Because going back to Tony's and people, it is also about quality. Fair trade now is absolutely leading with really high quality stuff. In the launch of fair trade, you know, more than 25 years ago, you know, the coffee, I'm told, was terrible and people bought it out of a sense of moral duty, but that's not the case anymore. This is about getting great high-end, good tasting, beautifully made things, but also knowing that they've been made fairly, that the supply chain is transparent, and yeah, that environmental protection's involved in the making. And yeah, so you don't have to suffer to support it either.
Yes, I remember saying something to someone a few months ago. Solidarity doesn't mean everybody has to suffer, and I think that's part of what I was saying before about trusting the customers. So the heritage sector knows their customers well, and they know that they can make the case for paying a bit more for something. So yeah, and understanding that they can tell that story. So yeah, Chris, in your opinion, who's getting it right?
I'm going to be honest, I really struggled with this one, not because I think there's lots of people not getting it right, but I think that there's so many good examples of businesses, from micro businesses up to large businesses, that are driving change. But I'm going to really, really cheat on this because I worked there for 5 years, but I'm going to call out Ben & Jerry's, mainly because of the model. So anyone that doesn't know it, the very basic Ben & Jerry's model is there's loads of people in the world that love cookie dough. How do we speak to them about stuff that actually matters? And I think it's so different to the way that lots of businesses approach this consumer engagement piece now, which in general actually seems to be here's how you as a consumer can mop up the mess that we're making, and this is why you should do it. And that is not a positive engagement with your consumer base. Whereas the Ben & Jerry's model is completely the opposite, which is like, here's a way of us speaking to a different audience about an issue that we know they care about, but maybe they don't know how to engage in it. And the Ben & Jerry's approach across Europe now is really focused on refugee and asylum rights. It's an issue that or a challenge that doesn't have a lot of positive engagement from a political and media narrative, and not a lot of businesses focusing attention on it. So if you can bring more of a mainstream audience into some amazing NGOs that are driving change on refugee and asylum rights, that can only be positive. So it's about using their platform to speak about social justice issues. And I think there are others that try to do that, but they do it from a, how do we get PR and comms from it? And having been in Ben & Jerry's, knowing that it is really embedded within who the employees of the business are and what they want to do in the world, I think is a great example, and we could do with more examples of that around the world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I've recently got back from Ghana, speaking to cocoa farmers, and the two corporations that we know pay considerably more than not just the Fairtrade minimum price, but the Fairtrade premium, are Ben & Jerry's and Tony's that we've already mentioned. And as a result, the cocoa farmers absolutely love them, so they're really keen to support them. So yeah, it makes such a difference when you know that people who are actually making your product value you as a customer, which moves me on nicely to my next question. We've touched on this already. Where do we think the customer is in all this? Do we think customers are quite happy to support brands in being more ethical? Do we think that they're still very price focused? Obviously the theme for Ethical Consumer Week is around the cost of living crisis, and up to a point we have to think about, as I've mentioned, the cocoa farmers, whose cost of living. So I'm going to hand over to Sian. What do you think? What's your sense of where customers are?
This is a really interesting one, because we know that attitude behaviour gap exists. So I don't think that comes from consumers lying or being deceitful in their answers to surveys. I think consumers genuinely do care about these issues and genuinely do want the products that they buy, the services that they engage, to be a positive thing rather than a negative thing. You know, no one wants to think that there were slaves involved in the chocolate that you're eating, or the toys you're giving to your children, or the garments that you wear. But we know that we're very time poor. We're in this system where actually we don't have a lot of control and influence in global supply chains. We're surrounded by greenwashing, so it's very hard to cut through that and understand what is greenwashing, what's not. And I think, to be honest, customers are just exhausted, and actually the cost of living crisis is only going to make this worse, because now more and more people that previously had that disposable income and that privilege to be able to buy more ethically and to put that time into finding those options are going to be feeling the impact of that cost of living crisis. And I do think that individual action and ethical consumption on that side of things is probably going to suffer as a result. But I think actually that exhaustion and that fatigue that's going to kind of be amplified by the cost of living crisis is coming from, you do get to a point with your ethical consumption where you're like, I'm doing everything I possibly can, and I'm still falling for greenwashing, and I'm still struggling to find, you know, a shampoo bar that works. That's a bad example, because there is an amazing brand called Kind 2 that makes really, really good shampoo bars, and she's in our Shop Ethical Instead campaign, so I have to call her out. But I think we are at that point where we are exhausted by that. We're struggling and we're still kind of falling for that. And actually, we just want to push back and say, well, what are you doing? Big corporations that are trying to sell me all this stuff. You're creating the need for these products. You're bombarding me with advertising. And what are you doing? And for us, we're doing our Shop Ethical Instead campaign, which was launched today, which is a positive alternative to Black Friday. And for the Christmas shopping period as a whole, really championing these small businesses, bringing them together to give them that collective voice, but with the aim of making it as easy as and convenient as it would be to go onto any other platform and browse and buy stuff that you don't know where it's come from, you don't know who's made it. And the driving message this year, obviously there's hundreds of talking points within that because these brands are all fair trade, ethical, sustainable, etc. There's so many messages we could pull on, but for this year we've really focused on the living wage side of things, because actually, again, creating that world that we all want to live in and creating that change collectively, if everybody is paid a living wage, we don't have a cost of living crisis and we come through that. So those of us that do still have the disposable income to be able to buy beautiful Christmas gifts this year, let's spend that in a supply chain where we know people have been paid a living wage. Let's spend it with local businesses and keep that money in the local economy. And let's spend it with ethical and sustainable businesses with supply chains that around the world are having a positive impact. And, you know, direct trade, fair trade, artisan makers, let's actually really take that view that if we all contribute to that and we all help to pay everybody a living wage, we can come through that together. So I think customers are exhausted of feeling that they're on their own. They're exhausted of being the ones that have to go out and do that research and do that work to find the most ethical and sustainable options. And I think actually the response we're seeing from the campaign so far is that, and the messaging that we've put out there is that actually they want that collective action. They want to feel that it's not us versus them with brands, that actually everybody is working to this bigger picture and this, not to sound cheesy, but this better world that we all want to create. And I think that's how we close that attitude behaviour gap, rather than that us versus them, you know, consumers are saying one thing and doing another, pointing the finger all the time.
No, that sounds great. And actually, yeah, a lot of it is just about having the tools and the understanding and knowing where to go, basically knowing what to trust and where to go. Andy, what are your thoughts on where customers are in this?
Yeah, I won't say too much. I think Sian, Lenshina and Chris are probably more experts on this, but I was just reflecting on the timeline and how things have changed over recent years. We're on a bit of a roller coaster ride, aren't we? And I think a couple of years ago, we could all see the rise of the ethical consumer and the fact that was starting to drive in pockets, you know, nowhere near where we needed to be, but it was starting to drive pockets of good behavior. And COVID lockdowns actually pushed a lot of us to buy local, you know, shop on our local high streets a bit more. And then the cost of living crisis has just, it's thrown everything up in the air, hasn't it? So it almost feels to me as if we somehow need to get beyond this, immediate crisis somehow. And let's not, you know, dwell on where that's come from and how that might be solved. But it feels like the long-term direction of travel's in the right direction. But right now, as Sian said, it's such a difficult thing to prioritize, isn't it? But yeah, I'm an optimist. Glass is half full for me in the medium to long term. But yeah, right now, gosh, give me some hope. Lenshina, Chris, give us some optimism.
Yeah, Lenshina, definitely. Lenshina, you're a shopkeeper, so you should be able to have a sense of where retail customers are.
You're expecting a shopkeeper to be optimistic right now. Well, yeah, we definitely saw last Christmas, particularly people coming out of lockdown, and they'd really, you know, they'd seen what had happened, they'd seen how connected the world is. They had a real new commitment to shop locally, to shop small, to shop ethically. And, you know, the number of people coming in saying, I'm doing all my shopping on the high street, my Christmas shopping this year. I'm not going to the big online companies. And, you know, it did really feel, yes, that there was this great direction that we were all traveling in. And of course, now we have been hit by this cost of living crisis. And there's no doubting all small businesses are worried, you know, how Christmas will be, because any small business relies on Christmas trade. So it's a worrying time. And I think, you know, what Sian was saying about how people feel that all the responsibilities on them. I have a friend who subscribes to Ethical Consumer magazine. And when it arrives, once a month, her son, who's 12, says, "Oh no, that'll be another list of things we're not allowed to buy anymore." People, they sometimes they could be so worried about what, because sometimes you can't choose everything. The Fairtrade bananas in the supermarket might be wrapped in plastic, and which is your priority. And I think people can get maybe too hung up on the guilt of it. Actually, we need to do the best we can. We need to, might buy less, but buy better with what we buy, and not feel that we have to do everything, but just know that we are all doing the best we can, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a phrase, there's no ethical consumerism under capitalism, but actually I disagree with that, because the way people use that is to say, well, you might as well just buy anything, and there's no point even trying, and it feels like that's wrong. It feels like, yes, you can say boycott, for example, Nestle, but actually if you don't give somebody an alternative, and yeah, they're just going to carry on buying from the brands that they already know and that are there in front of them. Chris, what do you think? Well, I know eBay's done some research on this into customer opinions about the sort of ethical and sustainable trade and the sort of thing that they're prepared to buy ethically.
Yeah, I think so. I think a few things. I think one, what we found from consumers is that they don't necessarily understand how to navigate this landscape. They don't necessarily know what a social enterprise is. And so there's a big consumer awareness job to be done. I think that also needs to be done across the various different progressive movements. And at the moment, you've got B Corp, social enterprise, fair trade, organic. You've got all of these different certifications, and it is hard to navigate. And I think having more collaboration between those various different sectors in the consumer messaging would probably be of benefit in the long term. But I think also what we've seen that consumers are willing to swap out. I haven't got the exact stats with me, Joanna, sorry, but we've seen that consumers are willing to swap out, particularly day-to-day staples was the thing that came out the highest. Things like toilet roll and things like that, people are willing to move in and out quite quickly. But I think also what we've seen is that it's got to be product first in terms of how you're marketing your business. It has to be a great product first and foremost, and then the impact is going to be the bit that tips people over the edge. And I think what we see a lot of is very much impact-led marketing, but there's still, I think, in consumers' heads, well, this is probably not as good as that X big brand that I already know, so I'll stick with what I do know. Whereas the reality is quite different. Often the products that we're seeing are so much better from social enterprises. Yes, they might sometimes come with a premium. And I think in this world of cost of living crisis, it's all about choice and providing more and more choice more than anything else. But also it's about all of us telling a story of what true value is. And I think Peter Holbrook at SUK talks about this a lot, and like how we determine what real value is. And if none of us want to buy stuff that is exploiting people, and us being able to tell a story about the real value in that product and why that product is so exciting for you, so that you do break down that guilt that we all have when we're buying stuff, is a powerful message.
Definitely, yeah, that's great. So we've sort of talked about where we are now and how we got where we are. What does the future look like? That's the final one of my questions. I'm going to go to everyone for just a couple of lines or a few thoughts about what the future looks like for collaborations between big business and sustainable and ethical and social enterprises. Come back to Sian first.
I think collaboration really is the key. And I think, we focus very heavily on kind of retail there because we've been talking about consumers, but sometimes it's recognizing that sustainable choice isn't just about going and buying something new. It's fundamentally the business models and the models of our behavior as well. So why do we all buy brand new stuff. You know, if you need to hang a picture on the wall, for example, and you don't have a hammer or a drill or whatever you need to do that, your gut reaction is to go and buy that and have it delivered same day or next day. And that's that problem solved. But you probably only use it once or twice, stick it in the garage, never think about it again. Whereas your neighbour might have one, you can go and buy it, borrow it from your neighbour. So, you know, thinking about, I really noticed that when I became a mum, because although I was already kind of trying to be as plastic free and eco-friendly as possible, passing down clothes and receiving clothes from friends because they grow so quickly, and, you know, going on to eBay and going on to Marketplace and just doing things from a cost perspective, but that are fundamentally more sustainable. And I think as businesses, we often don't necessarily shout about those messages, and we focus very much on the kind of individual pieces. And I think that's where we've got to a world where there are certifications for every single piece to try and overcome that greenwash. So I think moving towards the future, as the consumers become more holistic about this, and I think some of that will be driven by the cost of living. You know, we've seen secondhand clothing become so fashionable with younger generations and functional for the older generations that maybe aren't doing it because it's the latest trend, but actually it's a good way of saving money in a cost of living crisis when your disposable income has shrunk, that we're moving towards more holistic models. So I really hope that we get to a point where it's not which tea and coffee on this shelf is fair trade and I'll pick that one and the supermarket will profit anyway. I hope it moves to, there shouldn't be any non-fair trade options, but if they are, they're the ones that should be labelled and called out. I also hope that we move to a point where actually businesses are less scared to talk about this stuff, and we do create that collaboration in a deeper way. And I think what we're going to find over the next few years, particularly coming back to the regulation environment and what's happening on one side from the financial regulators and on the other side from the advertising standards, the competition markets authorities, the nature of how things are certified and what is used as a selling point is going to change. So I really do think, and I am an optimist, I think you have to be in this space against all the factors telling us not to be. But I really do think we are moving to a point where actually this is starting to become embedded now, and it's not just a greenwashing, purpose washing exercise to try and get our money. It is, you know, in a way, that is what will make it become more accessible to everybody, because that will shift and embed it into the business models, shift the behaviour, and create a different way of us engaging in this conversation, where it isn't just about the PR, the marketing, the selling point. It's actually the way that we do business. So I think we've still got a long way to go. You know, a lot of those regulations are not perfect. The advertising regulators are just starting to get their head around this stuff, but they've got teeth. We've seen some big high profile cases in the past couple of weeks even, and past few months, and they're starting to narrow in on certain sectors. And I think that kind of carrot and stick approach, in the past, it's been kind of the carrot of getting the consumers with the disposable income who want the, you know, the trendy thing in sustainable products, but now it's more of a stick with the regulators. And I think because we've got it coming from both ends, businesses are really starting to take this seriously and look at how they can collaborate to make this happen. So I'm feeling positive about the future, I think.
Yeah, so that's great. So Sian thinks the future is all about collaboration and making unethical trade the outlier. Andy, what do you think? What's the future in your eyes?
Wow, it's hard to predict the future at the moment, isn't it? But I mean, if we extrapolate from what's been happening over the last few years, a few years ago, we were shouting to the world about social enterprise and trying to convince people that it was worth working with social enterprises and privatizing social value and that sort of thing. Fast forward to 2022, and it's almost the other way around now. A lot of businesses are coming to Social Enterprise UK, thankfully, and saying, help, how do we do this? How do we do social value? How do we diversify our supply chains? How do we bring sustainability into our supply chains? So I'm also an optimist. I think that's going to continue. I think more and more big businesses are going to do that, and all sorts of other buying organizations. Our future at SEUK, just one thing we're doing now is trying to do this across Europe rather than just in the UK. We know that corporations across Europe want to buy social as well. So that's the optimistic thing as well. And But yeah, I would love to see more examples like Patagonia, right? Which kind of was a bit out of the blue, right? And of course, it was down to one man who had reached a certain point in his life and decided, right, I didn't want to be a big businessman. I wanted to be a social enterprise, basically. But I would love to see more examples like that, where, you know, large businesses have decided, right, we do have a central purpose. We've got a responsibility here. Let's see what is the most we can do for society. What's the most we can do for the planet, and gear our business up in that way instead. So fingers crossed we get more of that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think the future looks like more businesses taking their responsibility to people and planet seriously. Lenshina, what's the future in your eyes?
Okay, I'm also an optimist, because you have to be to do this, as we've all said. In another life, I worked as an engineer and in a company that made silicon chips. And it was a real fast, cutthroat business. And we changed owners probably as quickly as we are changing prime ministers at the moment. And in one of these meetings, we were told that the company had gone bust again, but someone was going to buy us out because they needed us to finish developing a certain product line. And someone said, well, once we've developed that, what will happen? And the manager said, well, then they'll shut us down and they'll move it back to their own facilities. So the person said, so what you're saying is we're working to cut off the branch we're sitting on. And in a positive way, I think that's what we're all doing, because in the future we want to see, well, then every business is fair trade, is a social enterprise, has those objectives. There's no need for BAFTS. There's no need for eBay for change, because all eBay is for change. No need for Social Enterprise UK, because all enterprises are social enterprises. So I believe that, you know, working together, that can happen, and that at some point we'll be able to say, well, we're all out of the job, but that's a good thing. Yeah, that sounds great. And also bringing in ethical hour, because a lot of people think of that sort of woman's hour. What about the rest of the time? And it's the same thing with, why is ethical hour only like 8 till 9 on a Monday? It should be all week.
Every hour.
Chris, what's your view of the future?
Yeah, I suppose mine's more of a hope. So I was at the last week or the week before. I mean, weeks are, I can never tell anymore. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation sort of biannual workshop a couple of weeks ago, and there was such positive energy in that room, but also a feeling of, I think that probably all of us feel a bit like everyone's feeling a bit drained at the moment, but I think the energy behind what does a circular economy look like from lots of big businesses was really, really energizing. But I think what the future needs to be is that you haven't got these separate networks for large businesses and then these separate networks for small businesses, but there's much more interaction between the two, because there's still just, you know, I've been saying this probably for 10 years, I think, and it still doesn't happen enough. There are not enough enablers for and networks for small businesses that really have a seat at the table at some of those large business networks. And I think that needs to happen, and in a less tokenistic way than you see it sometimes at large conferences. So I think if you can start to get that interaction between large and small in a much more effective and consistent way, then we'll start to see more change and more rapid change.
That's great. Thanks very much. So thanks to all of our panelists. I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. I know there's a couple of questions in the chat. Wendy's asking for, can you give some examples of micro businesses who are now working with larger businesses? I think, Andy, that might be one for you.
Yeah, we were replying to the questions as we were going along in the chat, actually, Joanna, but I mean, we've got a lot of micro social enterprises that are working with large businesses. I mean, I noticed that you're in Gloucestershire. Yeah, is it worth having a conversation with our friends at SoFab Sports? Chris and Joanna both know the team at SoFab Sports. I'm not even sure you'd call them a micro business anymore, but they've been quite successful, haven't they?
Yeah, no, but the team at SOFA, because I was actually in Gloucester visiting them a few weeks ago, and they know a lot of the other certainly social enterprises in Gloucester, so they would be a good place to get in touch.
So yeah,
actually, I almost think that rather than individual micro businesses approaching bigger businesses, doing it as part of the Bisocial Corporate Challenge is probably a better idea, rather than trying to sort of, as almost everyone's mentioned, it's about working together as organisations. So, if you become a member of SE UK or BAFTS or Ethical Hour, you're part of a community. And eBay for Change, you're part of a community of social and fair trade enterprises, and you support each other. And that's people will always be really good, in my experience, at giving advice.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, it looks like Wendy's talking about, well, I'm not a fair trade organisation necessarily, or not necessarily a social enterprise, but what else is out there? I mean, you've got chambers of commerce and Federation of Small Businesses, I suppose, as well. I mean, I don't know how much they're really pushing on this angle, but yeah, no, I agree.
They're not really. I've pretty much exhausted all of those avenues.
Okay.
So how difficult is it to become a social enterprise? It's literally just me and my eco business. Is it difficult? Is it costly?
To become a member of Social Enterprise UK is free if your turnover is below 100k. And is it difficult? We've got 5 criteria that we look for, and they're on our website. But
okay,
I'll have a look at the website. I'll pop my email in the chat as well, and very welcome to follow up with me, and we can have a chat. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
It's certainly not costly, but in terms of setting up, because all it requires is a sort of legal. If you're working as a sole trader or a partnership at the moment, it would be a case of thinking about setting up a community interest company or a company limited by guarantee, depending on how useful that is. SE UK has a tool called Purposely that helps you work your way through whether you're a social enterprise and what sort of social enterprise you are, and all of that information is on the Social Enterprise UK website. We had another question in the chat from Slovenia about what are the key factors for decision makers at large to medium businesses choosing a social enterprise as a supplier. And again, that feels like something for you, Andy.
Well, yeah, I think I put something in the chat as well briefly, but just to expand on it, and I said it earlier on, I think a lot of companies are really unsure about what they can do on diversity and inclusion, what can they do on climate, carbon, what can they do on social value. So those factors are driving them in the right direction, and it is sometimes regulation, it's sometimes government. If you want to work with government, you have to show social value in your operations and in your supply chains now. So part of this is being driven by government expenditure, thankfully, and we've found all sectors of the economy. To answer the second part of the question, we found all sectors of the economy actually keen to engage, but Sian's given an even more nuanced answer as well. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Sian.
Thanks, Andy. It's just kind of front of mind at the moment because we're working on a big ESG report for a national housing association, and they have to obviously report their social value as part of the ESG report, and it's actually going to be a legal requirement. They're doing it voluntarily this year, but for that entire sector, reporting their ESG is going to be a legal requirement going forward. And to be honest, a lot of these big corporations, and obviously they're not a corporation, but they are at the size and scale of FTSE companies, so it very similar sort of mindset. And you come to doing this and the education isn't always there all the way through the organization as to what ESG is, what they should be reporting. That's why they bring people like us in, but then they're kind of scratching around for data and stories they can tell and the way that they can build that narrative. So because they've got a legal requirement to demonstrate that anyway, if you can come in with that knowledge and say to them, well, actually, you buy however many paper towels, to just pick a really boring example, every single month, but if you just switch that to a social enterprise supplier, that is some additional social value that then you can account for, you can put in, it's a nice story to tell, and it's a win-win because that's now embedded in your supply chain. Social enterprise benefits, you benefit because of that reporting. So I think it's going to get easier to have these conversations with the right lens to get people engaged, because I think often what you find when you kind of take this messaging to corporates is you'll get one person who is kind of, let's take the environment as an example, you know, climate, the green champion in the organization who's really, really passionate. They're the person that's carrying the recycling home on their bicycle because there's no recycling bin in the office and they're really pushing for it. And they will totally get what you're talking to them about and they will totally be brought in. But because they're in that corporate ecosystem, they then have to go and sell that to layers above them, to other departments, and to get that buy-in. So often it's not that people don't care about it, it's just that they need to see how it fits with their piece of the organization and their piece of the puzzle. And actually that standardized reporting, I think, is going to make that easier. So in terms of the kind of low-hanging fruit to engage at the moment, anyone that's having to do this for a regulation issue, and especially if it's new regulation like the ESG reporting, because the chances are that the people that are kind of inheriting that within the organization, there's not a specific department for that yet. It will cross departments, so it will be marketing, comms, finance, social impact if they have that. So it will be across departments, and there's an ownership issue. And I think when there are ownership issues and people are still learning and still figuring it out, that's when there's a really good opportunity to get in there and create some change.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much. So unless there's any more questions, which it looks like there are.
Sorry, hi Joanna. I put one in quite early on to Andy because I was just interested after his initial 5-minute intro talking about engaging with social enterprises. It was the same question. I'm not a social enterprise. I'm probably going to become one with how I want to grow my business, but I'm not at the moment. I'm under a limited company umbrella. So do you engage with anybody outside of those social enterprises on that program of giving small businesses support?
Our program's only for social enterprises.
Sorry, it was for Chris.
Oh, for Chris, sorry. You said the wrong name there, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, it's my fault.
I'm so sorry, I can't hear at the moment just because there's a whole crowd coming through. You might have to repeat it in a second.
Yeah, no, right back at the start in chat, I put a question in at 11:30. Yeah, just asking really about do you engage with other eco, green, ethical businesses that aren't social enterprises?
So sorry about that. Yeah, the crowd's passed now. So we do, but the eBay for Change program specifically with that package of support that I mentioned is for registered social enterprises. But then we have our trading teams, for example, that work normally with slightly larger businesses, to be honest, but there is a sustainability focus from their point of view in terms of acquiring new businesses onto the platform that have a very clear sustainability focus. So that would be the other route in.
Yeah. How many are you able to manage then on that program if they are at social enterprise business?
So on the eBay for Change, we've just brought on our latest cohort and we've got about 100 social enterprises on that right now. So we can accommodate probably a little bit more than that, and we'll have the next recruitment round will go live towards the end of the year, Joanna, right?
Yeah, January. We're looking at straight after Christmas to start the recruitment, but we're actually, you can apply now. So we have a dedicated place where you can apply to join eBay for Change. All the information about it is on there. So I'll pop that in the chat. And I'll also, all of the links that are in the chat, I'll send out an email to everyone who signed up via Eventbrite with all of the links and a link to the recording to watch this if you want to share it with other members of your team and what have you. But yeah, it's joinebayforchange.co.uk is the where you find out all the information. We are recruiting now, but you won't be able to start with us until April of next year. So we bring enterprises on twice a year. But obviously, if you know now that you'll be interested in joining that in April, you've got the opportunity to become a social enterprise and to sort all that out before you come on in April.
Yeah, sounds brilliant. Thanks. I've got to say this has been valuable. Just over an hour and a quarter today. It's been really, really interesting because I almost gave up a couple of months ago in trying to grow my business, because I seem to have tried and failed and tried and failed. So I'm on a new spurt. So hopefully this might be another way forward for me.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, I really hope that's the case for you, Wendy.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks to everyone else for joining us. As I say, I'll send out an email to everyone with the link to the recording and all of the links. And I just want to thank all of our panelists, John Conway-Wood, Andy Daly, Lenshina Hines and Chris Gale. And thank you all for coming along.
Thanks all. Take care.